The War of the Worlds was written by H.G. Wells between 1895 and 1897. It tells a first-person account from the point of view of a writer, and in one section his brother, of an invasion of Earth from Mars. Humanity was unprepared and unequipped to handle the threat, and as a result, the Martians had little hindrance to their goals. But who were the Martians? What were their motivations? How did their technology work? And what were they like? No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope scrutinizes the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, man went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It's possible the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older world of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet, across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. This is the opener of the book. It does a lot to build suspense and help set up the enemy humanity is to face. Mars in this setting is a dying world, and it has been dying for centuries. The Martians have been aware of their situation for a very long time and have had to adapt to the changes to their environment and the loss of their natural resources. The narrator of the story begins with a discussion about the conditions of Mars and that of the Martians themselves, years after the invasion took place. With a tone of hindsight, we get a picture of what led to the invasion. In the words of the narrator, "The last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediate pressure of their necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts." The Martians' struggle to survive resulted in what was possibly a peaceful race originally, becoming the malevolent, cold, calculating monsters we find in the book. The narrator continues, "And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry Warfare Sunward is indeed their only escape from the destruction that generation after generation creeps upon them." It is interesting to note that the first chapter of the book spends a fair bit of time discussing the plight of the Martians. They are not evil because they want to be evil. They are evil by our standards because they are trying to survive. However, the setup for the Martians is also based in contemporary literature, Wells's own musings, and political reflection. Invasion literature was popular at the time, the idea of some outside force coming in and conquering the British Empire, or being thwarted by the brave heroes. This idea proved some inspiration, as well as a discussion Wells had with his brother about the possibility of a stronger enemy from space doing the same. Another aspect of this story is a commentary on colonialism and imperialism, and Wells was not subtle about this. The paragraph immediately after the last quoted had this to say: "And before we judge them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit?" For those who think sci-fi wasn't political until recently, I'm sorry to say, it always has been. Aside for the wording of this paragraph being kind of uncomfortable to modern audiences, it was also uncomfortable to contemporary readers, as it made the Martians an exaggerated mirror of European colonialism. The Martians' motivations were different and much more pressing. England was not dying. Mars was. Although I will cover more about their evolution later, we can infer that the Martians had to make sacrifices along the way in order to survive a more harsh environment. The coming death of their planet spurred technological and scientific advancement. The Martians, by necessity, had to develop more and more advanced technology to try and stave off the inevitable. In much the same way war spurs advancement, so too does external existential threats. As implied above, the Martians had to fundamentally change their civilization and society to address one concern: their survival as a species. The reality of their diminishing environment and failure for their technology to stem the tide caused the Martians to develop into cold, calculating beings who have long ago lost base emotions such as empathy and compassion. Replaced instead with cold logic and technological reasoning. Think the Vulcans from Star Trek, but racist. Well, more racist. The Vulcans are actually pretty racist in basically every Star Trek show, with one writing a paper on why humans are inferior, but this isn't a Star Trek video. Unlike humans who have the capacity to develop empathy and compassion towards non-human lifeforms, the Martians don't. Everything that isn't them has no rights and has no value beyond what they can use them for. And the Martians do utilize lesser species, but we'll cover that later. They view everything as an equation, as a science problem. Every action is a means to an end. Every decision is calculated to further the survival of their race. It's probable every Martian worked the problem and every Martian was involved. Judging by observations made by the narrator of Martians working together without any kind of visual or auditory communication, this implies they are telepathic. They are likely not a hive mind, but on Mars their telepathy would make group decisions easier and mass coordination stronger. It's not entirely known exactly when the Martians made the decision to migrate sunwards towards Earth and Venus, but a paragraph in the first chapter gives us a hint. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the Red Planet. It is odd, by the by, that for countless centuries, Mars was the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready. This implies, for at least multiple decades, possibly more, the Martians had been active in their plans. For as long as telescopes had been watching, astronomers had been seeing changes in the surface features. How much of this would have been just planetary projects to try and slow their planet's death, and how much was direct invasion planning, is unknown. But considering how they launched their invasion, it would have been a monumental undertaking, requiring decades of planning and work. It is very possible they made the decision as far back as the 18th century, and spent the latter half of the 1700s and most of the 1800s preparing. The Martian technology is reflective of their mindsets and gives us another glimpse into their civilization. The Martians utilized many machines, all with a specific purpose, starting with arguably their largest bit of technology we are aware of, the space gun. In the real world, H.G. Wells borrowed the idea of the space gun from Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon. In the book, there is a logical reason behind why the Martians utilized it versus conventional spacecraft. The Martians did not need complex vehicles. There was no round trip needed or planned. They just needed to get the bulk materials and personnel off Mars and on their trips to their various destinations. To this end, they built a massive space gun to launch large projectiles that likely had active guidance systems on board. We may not know exactly when they decided to invade Earth, but we do know roughly when the space gun was constructed. The narrator explains. During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk, first at the Lick Observatory, then by Perrotin of Nice, and then by other observers. English readers heard of it first in the issue of Nature, dated August 2nd. I am inclined to think that this blaze may have been the casting of the huge gun in the vast pit sunk into their planet from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near the site of the outbreak during the next two oppositions. As for how it worked, we find a clue in the narrator's observations with his astronomer friend Ogilvy. As Marge approached opposition, Laval of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It had occurred towards midnight of the 12th, and the spectroscope to which he had at once resorted indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with enormous velocity towards this Earth. The plumes were primarily incandescent hydrogen. This leads me to speculate the Martians utilized a massive light gas gun. A detonation propels a piston which compresses a light gas, such as hydrogen or helium, to accelerate the projectile. Hydrogen would have been fairly easy for the Martians to source from subsurface ice. The compression, ignition, and possibly some other aspect of the gun's operation caused the hydrogen to become incandescent. The space gun had limitations. Shots only happened once a day, and observations of Mars revealed thick clouds circling the planet after 10 consecutive shots. A limiting factor may be a resource common on Earth, but growing scarce on Mars: water. If the gun was indeed a hydrogen light gas gun, it would take a large amount of manufactured hydrogen per shot. This would likely have required diverting the ever-precious water from other uses to that of the gun. Both in and out of the book, there are theories as to why the shots stopped after 10, one being the polluting clouds causing the Martians inconvenience. This is unlikely, as the Martians would have known of the effects of the gun and planned accordingly. Most likely, the first 10 shots were a vanguard force to exterminate humanity and prepare the Earth for the main migration. Another option is that Mars had no intention of migrating the full population, and instead sent small groups to Earth and Venus with the intention of them colonizing the planets and preserving their species, with the rest of the Martians remaining on Mars to further try and extend the planet's life, or die with their homeworld. Considering the calculating nature of the Martians, both of these options made sense. The Martians knew of humans and our behaviors before the invasion. It would make more sense to eradicate us before risking the rest of the population. On the other hand, sending small groups of colonists to simply preserve the species is not only a logical choice, but the same thing we would do if faced with an unavoidable cataclysm. The Martians had also seemed to make a successful landing and established presence on Venus. In the epilogue, the narrator, while musing about the fate of the Martians, recites observations made by astronomers. 7 months ago now, Venus and Mars were in alignment with the Sun. That is to say, Mars was in opposition from the point of view of an observer on Venus. Subsequently, a peculiar luminous and sinus marking appeared on the unilluminated half of the inner planet, and almost simultaneously, a faint dark mark of a similar sinus character was detected upon a photograph of the Martian disk. One needs to see the drawings of the appearances in order to appreciate fully the remarkable resemblance in character. This would indicate the Martian efforts on Venus were far more successful. Either they made light work of the native inhabitants, or Venus is lifeless within the universe of the book. I would personally assume lifeless, as Venusian bacteria would have taken them out just like Terran bacteria did. The cylinders had a green color upon entering the atmosphere, which hints at their exterior composition containing copper. Possibly in the ablative material used to protect them upon entry, as the cylinders themselves were made of a white metal with a yellowish tone. The material is never identified, but it's most likely an alloy or something, like a zinc chromate coating on a silvery metal like steel. Each cylinder seemed to hold 5 Martians, 5 disassembled tripods, 2 handling machines, and 2 or 3 provisions. We know 7 of the 10 cylinders landed, and another 3 probably landed elsewhere away from the narrator. From this we can determine that during the invasion there was around 50 Martians on Earth to begin with, 50 tripods. This is a rather small group, which leans more into the exterminator theory, however it can fit into the colonist theory judging by their biology, that we will cover later. The cylinders were roughly 27 meters across, or about 90 feet. How long they are is not stated, but it was likely mostly buried in the crater. It's also safe to assume the end of the cylinders had a tapered bullet shape, with the exposed section being the back of the projectile. After the first cylinder landed in Horschel Common, a crowd of gawkers amassed around the pit in the following morning, as is human tradition. The Martians waited until the cylinder was cool enough before unscrewing the exposed section and emerging. I will cover the Martians' appearance when we get to their biology, but as you probably already know, they are very much not humanoid. As is another human tradition, the first responses upon seeing a Martian's unearthly visage were as followed. There was a loud shriek from a woman behind. One man I approached, he was, I perceived, a neighbor of mine, though I did not know his name, and accosted, but it was scarcely a time for articulate conversation. "What ugly brutes," he said. "Good God, what ugly brutes!" He repeated this over and over again. Suffice to say, the immediate human reaction was not a positive one. After gathering their composure, some people decided to try to be friendly to the alien visitors, grabbing a white flag and approaching the pit, because, yeah, sure, aliens would understand the meaning of a white flag. Anyways, upon the human encroachment, what did the Martians do? They did what you'd expect them to do. They sanitized the area. Utilizing a directed energy weapon that made people and trees burst into flames upon contact, the gawkers were incinerated and dispersed. The narrator describing it, then slowly the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Slowly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it. Forthwith flashes of actual flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Suffice to say, the immediate Martian reaction was not a positive one. This weapon, known as the heat ray, was the primary weapon used by the Martians during the invasion. How the heat ray works is questionable. In the book, it's described as an immense heat generated within a chamber of near absolute non-conductivity that is then projected in a beam via parabolic mirrors. The beams themselves are invisible, with only a bright flash being seen from the emitter itself. This description makes me suspect it's some kind of incredibly powerful CO2 laser with an unknown power source, perhaps utilizing vacuum energy. Vacuum energy is a kind of zero-point energy that makes up the background energy that permeates the entire universe. This is a very complex topic full of unknowns and uncertainties, but the long and short of it, if you could somehow harness this energy, you would have unimaginable amounts of energy in a very small space. Depending on who you ask, we're talking about 10 to the power of 9 joules or 10 to the power of 113 joules per cubic meter. So, energy equivalence between dynamite and that of hydrogen bombs. If the Martians' understanding of physics allows it, maybe that's what the non-conductive chamber was doing, harvesting energy for use in the heat ray. I could be overthinking this, but hey, the descriptions are vague. The next weapon we see used against the human populations was the black smoke. The black smoke appears to be a chemical weapon, an aerosol that clings to the ground and kills any living thing that comes into contact almost immediately. Contained in canisters fired from a gun-like device and shattering upon impact, the black smoke spreads rapidly, smothering everything in its path. The narrator observing its use, "It was heavy, this vapor, heavier than the densest smoke, so that after the first tumultuous uprush and outflow of its impact, it sank down through the air and poured over the ground in a manner rather liquid than gaseous. The black smoke left behind a thick residue like a soot that clung to surfaces, like cigarette tar in lungs. Also like cigarette tar in lungs, the black smoke harmed everyone and everything around it, not just the direct targets. The black smoke also reacted to water, creating a black scum that sank in water and clung to the ground. After its use, the Martians would fire jets of steam into the smoke, which broke it up and turned it into the black mess that covered the ground. A curious aspect of the black smoke is it's only toxic in its aerosol form. The narrator mentions if you strain the black scum out of water, you could drink the water with no ill effects, yet the vapor would kill you instantly. What exactly is the black smoke remains a mystery. Later analysis of the black smoke indicated an unknown element with 3 spectral lines in the green, and that it possibly reacts with argon. Argon does not react with anything and is very rare in our atmosphere, so I'm not entirely sure where he was going with that. As for the spectra, 3 lines in the green sounds like either thallium or mercury, although both are not a perfect match for the description. This is a case I wish Wells was more vague. Adding in a specific spectral pattern gave away too much information and too little. So we'll have to just accept that the black smoke is a mystery vapor that kills in unknown ways. Both the black smoke and heat ray are utilized by the most iconic bit of Martian tech, the fighting machine. The Martian fighting machine was the main tool utilized by the Martians in their efforts to conquer the planet, the narrator describing his first encounter with one as such. "And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them aside in its career. A walking engine of glittering metal, striding now across the heather, articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. A flash, and it came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air, to vanish and reappear almost instantaneously as it seemed with the next flash 100 yards nearer. Can you imagine a milking stool tilted and bowed violently along the ground? That was the impression those instant flashes gave, but instead of a milking stool, imagine it a great body of machinery on a tripod stand." Standing at over 30 meters, or 100 feet tall, the machines were giant 3-legged walkers comprised of a main body with a hood in which the Martian pilot resided on top, and below was a cluster of tentacles. Their finish appeared to be similar to aluminum, so different from the metal used to make the cylinders. The tentacles were metallic, like metal cabling with the dexterity and functionality of a biological tentacle. They were used for grasping objects, exploring their environment, and wielding weapons. Some tripods also had a metal basket on the back, which looked like a large fishing net. Tripods with this net were often seen collecting humans and storing them in the net to be taken back to their camps. The tentacles worked similar to how the legs worked. The legs of a Martian fighting machine are described as being articulated with joints. A curious aspect of Martian technology is it doesn't include the wheel. Instead, the legs and the tentacles operate using a synthetic muscle, giving them an organic motion and dexterity. How this muscle works is unknown, but it's probably a refractory metamaterial, or perhaps a hydraulic or pneumatic artificial muscle that utilizes a bladder to expand and contract. I say pneumatic or hydraulic because the fighting machines have 2 aspects that could mean one or the other. As the tripods walk, a green gas is emitted from the joints. This could mean they're pneumatic. But the tripods are also full of a mysterious brown fluid, which feels hydraulic. It could also be a combination of the 2. The joints also utilize a sliding bearing mechanism, so all in all, Martian technology is strange and, as you would expect, rather alien. Martian fighting machines were not impervious to attack. Humans did manage to destroy a few. In one instance, a fighting machine was taken out when it took an artillery shell to the face. The narrator witnessed the event close up, and as he cowered in the river under the tripods, 6 artillery guns, which were hidden, got the drop on the Martians and fired in unison. I gave a cry of astonishment. I saw and thought nothing of the other 4 Martian monsters. My attention was riveted upon the nearest incident. Simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air near the body as the hood twisted around in time to receive, but not in time to dodge, the 4th shell. The shell burst clear in the face of the thing. The hood bulged, flashed, was whirled off in a dozen tattered fragments of red flesh and glittering metal. Interestingly, after the Martian inside the fighting machine was promoted to fertilizer, the tripod kept operating for a bit before collapsing. It was described as moving like a drunken giant. The tentacles holding the heat ray remained raised up, and the tripod continued walking, trashing buildings as it went before collapsing into the river, producing a splash of steam and mud. Its tentacles continued to writhe as the ruddy brown fluid spurted out of the machine in large quantities. The narrator was burned and his day was further ruined, but he escaped. A couple fighting machines were also taken out by the ironclad Thunderchild. The narrator's brother was escaping on a steamer with other refugees when 3 tripods waded out into the water towards them. The Thunderchild emerged, and with its engines at full speed, it drove directly at them. The Martians were confused at first, not reacting, but as it got near, one shot a black smoke canister, which did nothing to stop the ship. By the time a tripod attacked the Thunderchild, it was too late. Opening up its main guns point blank, a tripod was shredded. The other tripods did start to melt the ship with their heat rays, however the flaming wreck of the Thunderchild was still moving at full speed and impacted one of the tripods, destroying it as well. The description was that the fighting machine was crumpled up like cardboard, which also reinforces the idea they are made of aluminum or some other lightweight soft metal. As a side, I always liked the Thunderchild. It was a very important part of the book, the last hope of humanity to effectively stop the Martians, and it was destroyed protecting a civilian steamer. The fighting machines of the book were terrifying instruments of war, but were not immortal. The tripods also emitted vocal sounds to one another, described as a loud alu sound, and later a distressed ula sound as they died. The Martian handling machine was similar to a fighting machine. It was a squat crab machine used for moving supplies and construction. It was basically a Martian forklift, so there isn't much to say about it. Similar to the embankment machine or digging machine, it's only mentioned once as being an autonomous digging machine used to widen the pits around the cylinders. Like the fighting machine and handling machine, the digging machine emitted puffs of green gas as they worked, indicating this green gas was a vital part of Martian technology. As stated before, the green gas and brown fluid could work in tandem or separate within Martian machinery. Considering the green gas is expelled and the brown fluid is not, the green gas may well be a waste product of the machine's normal operation, building up and being expelled through valves in the joints. The final machine utilized by the Martians was the flying machine. Very little is known about it beyond it was flat and wide and could fly, perhaps some kind of flying wing or lenticular lifting body. There are no detailed descriptors about it. It was only mentioned a few times to the dismay of humanity, in test flights, abandoned on the ground, and later reports indicating it was used to dispense black smoke upon populations. Martian technology takes a form more akin to bodies or suits the Martians utilized as extensions of themselves. Since, by themselves, the Martians are rather vulnerable and not terribly graceful, let's explore more about the creatures behind the machines. The Martians were described in detail. They were large, rounded bulks, roughly the size of a bear, had 2 large eyes, a lipless V-shaped mouth, and a grouping of tentacles on both sides of their body. Their skin was brown, had the appearance of wet leather, and they pulsated and moved in a sluggish, almost painful fashion. The narrator had this to say: "Those who have never seen a living Martian can scarcely imagine the strange horror of its appearance. The peculiar V-shaped mouth with its pointed upper lip and absence of brow ridges, the absence of a chin beneath its wedge-like lower lip, the incessant quivering of its mouth, the gorgon groups of tentacles, the tumultuous breathing of the lungs in a strange atmosphere, the evident heaviness and painfulness of its movement due to the greater gravitational energy of Earth. Above all, the extraordinary intensity of the immense eyes were at once vital, intense, inhuman, crippled, and monstrous. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the tedious movements unspeakably nasty. Even at this first encounter, this first glimpse, I was overcome with disgust and dread." Suffice to say, not a pleasant visage. An odd aspect about them is they did make vocalizations and had an ear of sorts. However, their main method of communication seemed to be telepathic. The ear was a large membrane on their back and was said to likely not work within Earth's thicker atmosphere. Despite this, the Martians still made hooting sounds and thick cries. This may be a vestigial behavior, or they incorporate vocalization into their communication naturally, and still do it even if they can't hear much on Earth. The tripods made vocalizations as well, but they were likely just for machine-to-machine communication, with the machines being able to detect the sound even in our thick atmosphere. The external strangeness of the Martians extends to their internal anatomy as well. In terms of organs, they were mostly brain, with bulky lungs and a heart. They lacked a lot of organs humans have, and seemed to not have very many systems, or at best, useless vestigial versions of them. They had no bones we would recognize, and moved by dragging themselves about on their tentacles. It's likely on Mars they would stand up on their tentacles and move about in a far more graceful manner, but with Earth's gravity being stronger, they had to make do. Remember when I said there was likely 50 Martians on Earth at the beginning of the invasion? Well, at the time of their deaths, there was almost 50 Martians in a single camp the narrator found. This means they either grouped up as they died, or they were reproducing upon arrival. The Martians were genderless, they had no concept of gender and had no sexual dimorphism. Instead, they reproduced via budding, with any Martian able to produce a polyp on their side that grew and detached, creating a new Martian. It's not stated how fast they mature, but budding would allow for Martians to reproduce quickly. This could account for how there seemed to be so many Martians by the time of their demise. And could make the colonizer hypothesis more viable. No need to evacuate the entire planet when a small group could quickly repopulate the species on another planet. Despite having a mouth, the Martians did not eat. Instead, they derived nourishment by extracting the blood from other creatures and infusing it into themselves. When they arrived on Earth, it was fortunate for them that humans have blood. On Mars, there is a second species of Martian, tall bipeds with fragile bones made of silicon materials similar to some sponges. A few bodies of these bipeds were found within the cylinders, indicating the Martians brought a few along as provisions for the trip. Their level of intelligence is unknown, but it's evident the Martians kept them as livestock, and since they used humans in the same capacity, it's possible they were intelligent. Dissections of Martians post-invasion showed they had very few organs, with the narrator describing how they fed as such. As strange as it may seem to a human being, all the complex apparatus of digestion which makes up the bulk of our bodies did not exist in the Martians. They were heads, merely heads. Entrails they had none. They did not eat, much less digest. Instead, they took the fresh, living blood of other creatures and injected it into their own veins. I have myself seen this being done, as I shall mention in this place. But, squeamish as I may seem, I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure even to continue watching. Let it suffice to say, blood obtained from a still living animal, in most cases from a human being, was run directly by means of a little pipette into the recipient canal. He also described the Martians happily hooting as the shrieks of a human victim they acquired echoed through the air. So, they drain the blood while the human is still alive. The simplicity of their anatomy and vast size of their brains indicates they evolved this way from a likely more complex creature. As mentioned earlier, they may have been humanoid like the bipedal Martians, but as their planet started to die, they had to rid themselves of unnecessary things, both mentally and physically. They do not feel love, they do not feel compassion or empathy for other lifeforms. They do not eat, taste, smell, or enjoy sex. They seem to feel something, happiness or at least anticipation, as they make hooting noises as they drain humans. Another thing missing from the Martians' bodies was microbes. Not a single Martian microbe was found in any Martian body, or the bipedal Martians, or in the redweed. Note, the redweed was a plant brought to Earth from Mars, possibly by accident or intentionally. It was a creeping vine that grew quickly in the presence of water. The redweed grew white patches before crumbling and dying due to infection. The redweed was susceptible to infections just like the Martians, and this is because Mars has no microbiotic life. This is not a natural state of affairs. The Martians had long ago eliminated all pathogenic life on Mars, and this effort resulted in all bacteria and viruses to be eradicated. It is curious to note that the Martians had not accounted for microbes on Earth. There are two explanations for this. Either they were aware of the presence of microbes on Earth, and they figured they would pose no threat due to having no experience with microbes for thousands of years, Or they simply did not know microbes existed on Earth, as the knowledge of microbes had been lost over time. Collective memory can warp and even be lost very quickly. An example can be found with vaccines here on Earth in a few places. When polio and measles vaccines were first available, people were enthusiastic about it, as everyone had seen the number of children crippled and killed by both viruses every year. Just 2 generations after eliminating those fears, people are now willing to let both come back as they have no first-hand experience with either disease. Another example is people making mistakes that lead to a disaster because rules put in place after a similar disaster were dropped years later after people stopped caring. So it's not a huge leap to say the Martians probably just lost the knowledge surrounding microbial life. The Martians had no immune systems, so as bacteria colonized their bodies, they essentially started to decompose from the inside. Considering they didn't show any distress until they started to die, it's also safe to assume they don't feel pain, otherwise they would have been suffering within days of landing on Earth. The narrator did say the Martians seemed to have a painfulness in their motion, but that was likely just their awkward, heavy motions and not indicative of actual pain. The fact bacteria were able to colonize their anatomy also indicates the Martians are warm-blooded. Being infused with human blood likely made their situation worse. Bacteria that exists in Terran life would have access to more of the chemistry and nutrition they are accustomed to within tissues flowing with human blood. As the Martians started to die, they were aware of what was happening, but unable to do anything about it. Something interesting to note that we can determine about the Martians based on their feeding habits and their deaths is the chirality of Martian proteins are likely the same as ours. The Martians were able to get nutrition from our blood, meaning their bodies could use the components in our blood to grow and reproduce. Moreover, birds and dogs were able to eat the dead Martians without issue, and at one point the narrator chewed on some red weed because it wasn't like he had anything else to lose at that point. Aside for an unpleasant metallic taste, he suffered no ill effects. If the chirality between Martian and Terran life was different, they would not be able to use our blood, and Terran animals would not have been able to eat their tissues. This is a small detail, but considering Mars, within the book's universe, is older than Earth by a lot, both Martian life and Terran life share chirality, and the Martians may have evolved from something similar to us, there is a possibility life on Earth was seeded by Mars, likely via meteors. It's not stated how old the Martian species is, but one can assume they existed for millions of years. When the Martians first evolved intelligence, Earth was likely just recovering from the Chicxulub asteroid impact. When the Martians first noticed their planet was dying, the earliest human ancestors were coming down from the trees. When the Martians started evolving into their current physical form, via nature, science, or a combination of both, human technology was stone tools and fire. When humans started the Industrial Revolution, the Martians were already drawing their plans against us. The Martians that attacked Earth could also be a second civilization with one earlier than them dying out long ago. Whatever the case, Mars had life before Earth, and there is an odd compatibility between the two worlds. This is pure speculation on my part, but the life on Earth the Martians coldly exterminated without thought may have been descendants of life that also led to them. And the microbial life that killed them here on Earth, in a way, offered a sort of revenge for their distant brethren the Martians eradicated on Mars long ago. The Martian invasion ultimately failed, but with their apparent establishment on Venus, there is hope for their continued survival. However, the ability to conquer Earth was likely lost with the first invasion. Humanity is now aware of them, aware of their technology, aware of their biology, and aware of their tactics. If cylinders drop on Earth again, they will be destroyed before they can even be opened. If they land in secret and try a land invasion, human military power will be ready. We have studied and replicated as much of their technology as we could. We learned how to split the atom in the decades since. World War I and II likely did not happen, but human concern over Mars would have prompted technological advancement in weapons, physics, and space travel. In a way, the Martians may have doomed themselves by attacking Earth instead of just going to Venus quietly. Two things can be said about humanity. We do not forget, we do not forgive, and we did not invent war, we perfected it. The collective trauma humanity experienced, the fear and uncertainty about the Martians possibly trying again, may fester for decades. Until, in the late 20th century, after developing new technologies and weapons, Earth reopens the War of the Worlds. But this time, the soil upon which the fighting takes place will be red.